Hello and welcome to the Active Best Practice Network webinar session. We are looking today at the data protection update with Pete Nolan. So Pete is joining me as a guest and I am Natalie Smith, the Workforce Relationship Manager from Active Herefordshire and Worcestershire. The idea of the Active Best Practice Network is to really share with people who work across Herefordshire and Worcestershire, encouraging physical activity, sport and movement into the groups and clubs and the community organisations that they work in. At Active Herefordshire and Worcestershire, we want to help support people across the counties to be active for life. So we are bringing some local best practice in these networks, and we're starting off with Pete, who's going to share some recent updates within the Data Protection Act. Pete has worked with Active Herefordshire and Worcestershire as a data protection consultant, so he's coming from an experienced position to be able to share some of these things that will hopefully make what can be sometimes a tricky subject a little bit more approachable and share some of the resources. We'll do the question and answering at the end of the session, and I'm going to hand over to Pete and I will see you at the end for some questions. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you, Natalie. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this update on data protection. I'll try and make it interesting. It's very difficult to do data protection after all, but it's September 2025, so let's go for it and see how we get on. There is a new Data Protection Act out, just come out recently, and the ICO, and as the slide says there, they are pursuing individuals and organisations more rigorously. Bottom line is they say, you've had plenty of time now. The last update to the Act was in 2018. Now 2025, there's a new act, so you've had plenty of time, you should be organised. Now, the flip side of that is they're not just using a great big stick, they are also putting out a lot of help, a lot of guidance. We'll give you links as we go through, but their website has a lot of information on it, and there are case studies, there are guides to what you can do, and as it says there, they're even looking at doing video guides. So you don't have an excuse, there's plenty of information. Now, what is new there at the bottom, it says focus on freedom of information. They are focusing in quite hard on that, and that potentially is the one thing that might require a lot of us to do some extra work. Not a huge amount, but it's an extra focus, and it may well be something we haven't covered very well. So I'll talk about that as well. But essentially, the changes are there. Now, this slide is just to talk about the fact that they're not messing about. This is close to home, as you can see. May 24, and it's a Birmingham Children's Trust, so it's a community interest company. And all that happened was that, as you can see there, some information was copied into a set of minutes. It's an easy mistake to make, anybody could do it. The ICO weren't having any of it. Now, they were lucky, it was a reprimand. There was no fine. They can fine as well. Now, they didn't in this case, but all that happened is we will all have been there. A bit of information accidentally copied across, but they are taking these things seriously. That's what I wanted to stress with this. The link is at the bottom there, as I say, on all the slides, so you'll be able to have a look at this for yourself. But please just understand how seriously the ICO are taking things now. There's no wiggle room anymore. Now, one of the good things they are doing, as I said, is that they are producing reports and guides and case studies. And one of the good ones is this one, it's the learning from mistakes of others. Now, again, the link's there, you can go through this. But essentially, they're talking about what security, they call it cyber security, but essentially what mistakes people make. So things like phishing. So that's the business where passwords are accidentally exposed. Everybody knows that phishing, I think, quite a popular term nowadays. But they talk about other things which you may not be so familiar with. It's what they call brute force attacks. Essentially, that's where they just keep bashing away. They use one of these password generators or something, just keep banging away, username, password, until they get through. Denial of service is unusual because what they try and do is they try and stop you working by basically overloading your systems. They will throw emails or they'll throw updates or they might fill in forms on the website, just basically keep throwing stuff at it and stop it working. Again, you'll say, why are they doing that? Well, mainly that's because then it, not necessarily always, but quite often becomes a ransomware type situation. So unless you then give them money or whatever, they will keep doing it. Errors, this is just ridiculous. Poorly implemented, where you set up a system or somebody set up a system for you and they just haven't changed the defaults. That's the most common one. You get an admin account, you set up a router, and you just forget to change the base password, so it's admin still, or it's 1234. It happens so many times. And then the fifth one there is difficult. It's supply chain attack. Essentially what that's talking about is it's not you, it's the people you work with. So a supplier or some client that you work with or something like that, they get infiltrated, and then that escalates up to you. Again, you could say, well, that's not our fault. Unfortunately, under the Data Protection Act, it is. If you are sharing personal information, you're expected to ask the question, are you following the rules and are your systems secure? That is upon you to do. That's what data sharing agreements are for. And again, we'll talk about all of this. But to be fair, the report does talk about, yes, if this happens, what can you do and what should you have done to avoid it? So again, as I said, they're not going, oh, this is what you've got to do, get on with it. They provide a lot of help and a lot of guidance. And just so you're aware, 85% of small businesses and organizations, phishing is how they get caught out. And it's mainly emails. So it's a very easy thing to stop. Train your staff. Don't reply to an email if you don't recognize it. Most people can handle that. Right. FOI is serious. Here we go. So freedom of information is serious. This is the Information Commission. It's actually a speech he was making. But they are, it says there, 5 public organisations. Funny enough, since I wrote this, it's now 6, but 5 will do is enough. Basically, they're not meeting their obligations. And I think, as you can see in the small notes at the bottom there, this one is the Department for Education. 80% of the requests were not met. And even more recently, it's 75%. So basically, even the DFE is not meeting what's expected of them. So their mindset within the ICO is, if they're not doing it, then how can smaller organisations be doing it? Now, unfortunately, in my experience, working with smaller organisations, most of them are very good because they take it seriously and then they go, we'll get it sorted. Unlike the DFE, who have a committee meeting about it properly and then have a subcommittee to discuss it. We just get on with it. But I'm making you aware, you need to look at FOI and you need to see what the rules are. There's very good guidance, very, very good guidance. And there are templates in actual fact for FOI, which there aren't for all of it, but for freedom of information, there actually are templates that you can follow and fill in. So it's well worth having a look at what they've got for that. Because again, as I said, there's no hiding space. They're not allowing hiding space anymore. Right then, here's the exciting bit. He lied. It's data protection. How can there be an exciting bit? But there's a new act, the new Data Use and Access Act. So it came out, you see there, June 2025. That's a surprise to about 99% of the population, sadly including many DPOs. I won't name it, but I had a conversation with a college only yesterday and said to their DPO, you're not compliant with the new act. And they said to me, what act? And that's a college of 1,700 students. But there you go. So here's but I thought a lot of confusion about, because people talk about GDPR, they talk about data protection, and I bang on regularly. Natalie will tell you this. I bang on regularly about the Data Protection Act, and everybody says GDPR, and I go, no, Data Protection Act. So I thought I'll just give you a quick timeline so we can understand what's going on. So we had the Data Protection Act in 1998. It was there, but it was largely ignored. And then the EU produced the General Data Protection Regulations. Now, when we were part of the EU, they applied to us. So what happened was we looked at them and went, right, most of it matched what we already had. But there were some updates, there were some changes, and even the EU GDPR said that certain countries had to implement things in their own ways, especially in areas like security and policing and things like that. So the Data Protection Act 2018 was the UK taking the EU data protection regulations and implementing them for the UK. So the Data Protection Act is the law in this country based upon the data protection regulations. So the Act is what applies, but we've brought in elements of the regulations. And then, of course, Brexit. So we left the EU. So the EU GDPR did not apply to us anymore. However, there was a transition period. And in that transition period, we've got what you can see there, which is the UK GDPR. So that is what we had during the transition. And then, quite rightly, the ICO said, we can't be doing with this. The Act needed updating anyway. We've got the regulation sitting there. So the Data Use and Access Act is again that step of Data Protection Act 2018 with some of the elements from the UK GDPR brought into it, and then we get the final act. So the DUAA is the act, it is the law in this country, so that's what you've got to comply with. If you work in the EU, you still need to be compliant with the EU GDPR. But I'm hoping you can see from that timeline that if you follow the DUAA, you will be compliant because it's a subset. Yeah, if you follow everything in the DUAA, you will have followed everything in the general data protection regulations as well. So you don't have to do both. But that's just to try and explain how we got to where we are. It's just an evolution, essentially. Now, one of the important things that's done, and again, this won't become obvious, but it will eventually have quite an impact, in that there is now a board that runs the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, is now run by a board. There's a CEO, there's a chair, and I believe there's going to be 7 non-executive directors, and they will be the Information Commission. So it will no longer be the Information Commissioner's Office, it will be the Information Commission's Office. And the thing I think that it will be good for is because there's 7 non-exec directors and a chair, they will have a broader spectrum view of the world. So they will bring a board level view in, which I think will be quite good actually. And again, we've seen some changes already, as it says there. The new act, the DUAA, doesn't really change things massively. It actually simplifies some things, it removes some anomalies, and I'll talk about some of these in a minute. And it just tidies up odds and ends here and there, so it's actually really good. The bad news, as you can see there, it came in June 25, and you're expected to have everything in place by June 26. So most of the people watching this will be going, oh no, we're nearly halfway through. Yes, you are. So, but again, it's not massive changes. Just be aware, get things done, you'll be fine. And as I said, the ICO, and they are doing it, they've said they'll provide guidance as things become clearer for them. And they are doing it. They really, really are. And again, the link is on that slide for you to go and find exactly what you need from them. There's a massive amount of information, and it will keep coming. So keep checking and keep looking. Right then, I've entitled this Helpful Changes because most of them actually are. These are the changes yet, and actually I think most of them are pretty good. There's a new thing called Recognise Legitimate Interests. Basically what it means is that for some things, you can use the data without having to go back and ask permission. Now, what they're intending to do is that there will be an agreed list from Parliament. And at the moment, there's going to be 6. It can vary, but there will have to be a parliamentary agreement before an item is added or removed to that list. You can see there that preventing crime and safeguarding are currently 2, obviously. So if you are looking at safeguarding, for example, and it says there, it removes the need for you to balance the individual rights against the benefits arising from that use. So essentially what it means is if you're looking at safeguarding somebody and you can see that they are at risk, you use their data to protect them. And it's now encoded in law, there will be no comeback. You still have to prove that it was necessary. It does not take away the bit about proving that it was necessary to do. You still have to think about it, but you don't have to go back to the person to ask permission. You don't have to justify the use of having their data. If you see a safeguarding issue and you can say it was necessary to protect that individual, you can use the data for that purpose. That's essentially what the Recognise Legitimate Interest means. And as I say, there'll be 6 in total. I'll show you what they are later. Now, the next one is quite handy. Disclosures that help other organisations perform their public tasks. So this is the example they give there is the police. But basically, it's good with the health service and things like that as well, because we had a lot of situations, especially at primary schools, where the health service was saying, give us this data. And then there was a lot of toing and froing because the primary school was saying, well, why do you want us to give you that data? What do you need it for? Now, as it says there, the organisation making the request must show why they need the data. So you can give them the data, again, as long as you understand it's necessary and you know they're responsible. But then if there's any queries in the future, they are the ones that have to say why they made the request. And again, I think that's only sensible. How can we say, why do you need the data? They should be saying, this is why we made it. It's a very, very sensible change. And then the last one on there, marvelous title, Assumption of Compatibility. I love these titles. They're as clear as mud, aren't they? It's the reuse of the data. So we all have to say why we're collecting data in the first place and why we need it. in our original data protection policy. We have to say that. But if we can use it for a purpose within that is logical and reasonable, then we can use the data without going back and asking for consent. And again, this makes sense. They've talked here about purposes of archiving in the public interest or further scientific research. They're fairly good examples. So if you've gathered all the data and you go, actually, in order to carry on this research further, you used to have to stop and go back and try and explain to people what the research was. You know, 9 people out of 10 didn't care. So I think that's, again, very sensible. The organisation says, this is why we wanted to use the data. This was the link, you know, blah, we're done. And again, another sensible sort of removal of a barrier that wasn't really doing any good. Now, this is the one that I think quite a number of organisations and charities will be just small cheers will come from this one. Soft opt-in for charities. This is terrific. If you're a charity, you can send electronic marketing to people whose information you collect when they support or express an interest in your work, unless they object. So express an interest, it doesn't say what that is. So, you know, go for it until we've got more clarity. If they express an interest in a charity, you can send them emails. Terrific. Now, the next one, subject access requests. This is great. You only have to make reasonable proportionate searches. See, all this worry about, do we make sure we've got all the data? Do we go digging through this? Do we go digging? No, you don't have to. Again, as long as you've made reasonable and proportionate attempts, that's fine. And again, I think that's terrific, because so many organisations were going round and round and round in loops thinking, have we searched everything? Have we looked in that cupboard? What happened to all that stuff when Dave left? Is that still in his drawer? You don't have to worry. As long as you've made a reasonable search. And I use the term Dave because normally it is Dave. It is a Dave. I don't know why, but it's always a Dave that causes problems. And also what they've also done, the thing they're making things clearer. They've rewritten elements. They've looked at cases that have been brought, and basically it's reworded some of the tests. It's reworded some of the chapters. It is much easier to read now, to be fair to it, much, much easier. And as it says, things like that. Direct marketing can be a legitimate interest. The tests when transferring personal information outside of the UK, I use that one because if you really want to send yourself to sleep, it used to be 4.5 pages of you must do this, you must do that, and it's now 2 paragraphs. It's so much easier to understand what you can and can't transfer outside the UK. So again, nice and easy. So if you're looking for something, it is easy to read. And the best one that we will all benefit from, cookies. Cookies only used to improve site functionality, don't have to have consent asked for. So you know when you go on a website at the moment and it goes, we use cookies, and that blessed pop-up window comes up before you can do anything. About 80% of them are going to go away, because if a cookie is only used for statistical purposes and just measuring stuff, they don't need to have consent anymore. And I personally think if the Act had done nothing else but get rid of those blessed windows that pop up when I'm trying to use a website, I would have paid good money for them to carry on and do it. So I think that's a big plus, that one. But it's silly things that annoy you, isn't it? But that really annoys me. Now, 2 new things that are important and you do need to be aware of and do need to think about. Children and online services. Now, this is important because it's not just if you provide a service to children. You've got to read what it says there. If it's likely to be used by children, so you don't even have to be targeting them. If it's likely they might use your website, there are explicit things that you need to take into account when you are setting things up. And it lists them there. Age-appropriate presentation of privacy information. So basically, your privacy notice must be written in such a way that a young person or a child can read it and understand it. Prominent default privacy settings. So it must be clear how they make sure privacy is enabled. You cannot profile, you cannot do geolocation. You cannot try and find out where they are. You must not do that. And that prevention of nudge techniques. There's all sorts of clever things on websites where they say, oh, just pop your name in here or just put a number here. And it doesn't all happen at once necessarily. No. If there's any chance of a young person or a child using your website or service, you cannot do any of those things. And as I say, that list is specific and it goes into a lot of detail. So if you've got any chance at all that any of your services, any of your websites, anything like that, And notice it says service. It's not just websites. We're going to talk about apps and telephone lines and all call help centers, everything. You've got to be aware of this. And then the other one, data protection complaints. Again, this is a requirement, but actually this is a fairly simple one to fix. You must have a method whereby people can make a complaint if they don't feel that anything's been handled correctly to do with their data when you've got it. As it says there, the simplest way, make sure you've got a form up on your website. Pop a form up, make sure it's there. Make sure you've got a process to acknowledge complaints there, 30 days. But again, that one is very simple. Have the form, make sure you've got a process internally which says if we get one, do it in 30 days. You're done with that. That's very straightforward. But I say those two things you must do and be aware of, please. And essentially, that's it. Data protection is serious and being enforced rigorously. So don't guess. Go and look. Safeguarding. Never, ever, ever put data protection first. Put safeguarding first. Nobody will ever fault you for that. And as you saw in the Act, it's now written in there as well. But never, ever doubt that. Safeguard people first. And we must have evidence of board level involvement. So the days when the board could go, oh, that's a managing director's job or that's a chief operating officer's job. Nope, no, it isn't. It's a board level responsibility and the ICO expect to see it. And then, because I admire Douglas Adams, the last one there, do not panic, ask your DPO. That's what they're there for. And if they don't know, they can go to the ICO and get help. So there we go. Thanks, Natalie. How's that?
Excellent. Thank you so much for that whistle-stop tour of informative highlights. So I think, as you say, many people might not have been aware about the new Act coming into place. So I think it's really important that we kind of share this, and particularly with our network who might be sort of smaller organisations or they might not have a lot of access to this type of information. So thank you for sharing that. There are a couple of questions, if you don't mind, that we'll just finish off with before we ask people to share their feedback. So one of the questions that came in from somebody who was attending was around, is there a recommended list of documents that you should have in place to ensure that you're adhering to the Data Protection Act or the DUAA?
Yes, there is, yeah. And it's one of those things where this is, if you like, the minimum list you should have. If you go beyond that, it's okay. But as a minimum, you need a data protection policy. Now that doesn't have. I get annoyed when I see ones that go on for 20 odd pages. I think ours is 4 for Active Herefordshire and Worcestershire, isn't it? It's 4 A4 pages. I think that's all it is, and that includes a bit of blank at the end. Essentially, in the data protection policy, you just have to say, this is what we're doing. This is our reason for collecting the data. There are various blanks of that around. I think we said we could share our template, didn't we, if we needed to? Yeah,
possibly if people want to get in touch if they haven't got their own. Yeah.
The data, you have to have the policy in place, and you must have that. And then the best way to approach it then is to have what I call procedures. So policy is all very well, but people don't have to follow it. If you have procedure, they are expected to follow it. And the procedures will be things like, if we have a data breach, what do you do? If we have a subject access request, what do you do? I think there's one for deleting data. So if somebody says their data wants to go, get rid of that. That's what you need. We definitely need a retention procedure, because you have to show that you retain only necessary data. And if you don't need it, get rid of it. If there's our other one is request to be forgotten. Somebody can ask to be forgotten. I mean, in terms of data, obviously we can't hypnotize people and go, you've never met Dave. But the data, we have to have a procedure for that, because we have to make sure we don't miss anything. And then we must have a security procedure. Now, I know we bang on about security, but now under data protection, we really must codify for people and say, this is the procedures. And then beyond that, we need privacy notices. So we need privacy notices for any sort of relevant staff members, any board members and customers. They're the minimum. But then again, you might expand that depending what individuals you hold data on. But if you like, that's the basics that you need.
Excellent, thank you. That's really, really helpful. You mentioned there the right to be forgotten, which I know was highlighted in the previous legislation as well. How does that work with when you talked about that? I think it was called assumption of was it compatibility? In terms of if you can kind of use the data to be archived or for that scientific research. Is that only if people kind of don't get in touch? I mean, where's the balance between holding on to data that you're not using and needing, and also people then having that right to ask you to get rid of their data if it's not being used anymore or they change their mind?
Exactly. It's one of those, you have to do your best. And there will be a court case on this, and then we'll know for certain. But as I understand it, the way it stands at the moment, you can ask to be forgotten, and we can make our best attempts to remove you from the archives and from the research. If we happen to miss some pieces because it's buried in like 1990, I'm sorry, we did our best. It's what you can do and do your best. Because again, I think you'll find a lot of archives, when it comes down to it, you can't in reality sift through and remove everything. So you do your very best. And in a request to be forgotten situation, if data on that person is found in a live system, we have no excuse. If it's found in an archive that is used once every couple of months and they're about 20 years ago buried somewhere, if you find them, delete it when you see it, if you remember. But do your best, but do not have it in a live working operating system. That's the main thing about request to be forgotten.
Yeah, excellent. So I guess it's as well just making sure you're aware of the sort of data retention periods for certain things that you hold, and making sure that when it's past that date that you're following the right processes.
Exactly. And that's the retention thing is the important one, because that's why I say we must have a procedure for that, because that says in it how long you keep all the different types of data for. So if somebody makes a subject access request and say they came back to you and said, well, you haven't got all my data here, we hold up the retention procedure and go, well, no, because we don't have it at all. Look, the retention procedure says it goes. So that's sort of the flip side of the request to be forgotten.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And you mentioned the subject access requests. When they come through are they always clear exactly what they want, or can they be a bit ambiguous? And what would you do if you got a request through and you weren't really sure what this person kind of wanted? How would you make that reasonable and proportionate search if it's not clear?
That's an excellent question. The clock doesn't start until you're sure. So it actually does say in the Act that until such time as you're sure about who the individual is and what it is they're asking for, the clock hasn't started. So you're well within your rights to go back and say, prove who you are, or what did you mean by X, Y, Z? So no, until it's clear, no, good question. The clock is not starting.
Excellent. I think that would be really helpful for people who might be a bit concerned or have dealt with that in the past. So
subject access request, if I may, the one thing you've got to do when you get one, stop, sit back, take a breath and go, it's okay. It's not that hard actually, but don't panic. Just sit back, take a breath.
Excellent, thank you. And obviously you've covered some of the different types of gaining of information, and you talk about cybersecurity, and obviously that's quite a heightened thing at the moment. So there's obviously the ICO, but there's also, is it the National Centre for Cybersecurity that have some kind of resources and training? Would you recommend people having a look at that if they want any extra support?
Absolutely. Yep. I do cybersecurity training for boards and things like that, and I will use some of the resources they've got on there. Now there's a slight difference. The cybersecurity is very much focused on these are the threats, these are how you mitigate them. The ICO is about how do you handle individual data. So the cybersecurity is a much more generic threats from cyber issues, because of course don't forget the cyber threat that we're facing is not just about individuals' data, although that's quite often involved. There are other threats. So cybersecurity is a much broader spectrum in terms of how do you protect yourself generally. So it's a very good idea. Yeah.
So I think there is some training on there. There's some links to that on our courses and workshop page as well. So you can access that and also there's stuff on the ICO website. And particularly if you've been affected and you're worried, there's great guidance on both sides about what you need to do. Obviously contact your DPO, but there's the initial steps that you can do to make sure you've got everything covered in the time periods.
I would say the cybersecurity, which you look on there, there's sessions for boards, and they're very good because they do take it at the correct level. They're not trying to get down into all the technical detail. They're saying, think about these things in these areas in these ways. So yeah, it is very good. Some of it, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And you mentioned the board level involvement as the kind of the highlight. Is that something new that's come in, or is that sort of tweaked in relation to the previous acts?
Yeah, so basically that came in with the 2018 Act. I mean, it was always there, but the 2018 Act made it explicitly clear that board level involvement has to be demonstrable and real. So it can't just be a tick the box type exercise. You'll know, we always make sure there's a standing item on data protection on the board minutes, and the agenda always has data protection. There may be nothing to discuss, but there's always something there. And we have a board member who is specifically responsible for data protection, and board members love it. So let's face it, they're unpaid volunteers, and we've given them something else to do that they know nothing about. But hey, that's the nature of being a board member. But the DUAA now is even more explicit. It is, you must have board level, it must be active, they must be aware of what's going on. And essentially it makes sense because some of the decisions that have to be taken cannot be taken at operational level. They are a strategic view and they must be taken at that level. All right, operationally, as always, we will implement them. But no, the board level thing is serious and it will be assessed.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much, Pete, and thank you for your time and for sharing this within our network. So for those of you that are watching, I hope you've enjoyed or found it informative at the very least. As I say, there's lots of resources out there. There's updated information on different parts of the DUAA and when the guidance is expected to come out from winter 2025-26. So if you have got any feedback, really it's just one question about what you kind of might do differently now, or an area that you might want to explore on the back of this webinar. We do have two other webinars. We've got the Introduction to Implementing AI on the 8th of December 2025, and we also have event planning using Martin's Law in February 2026. So you can head over to activehw.co.uk to courses and workshops for seeing all of the list of the information and also the webinars, the future webinars. So thank you for joining us. We hope it's been informative and we hope to see you at one of our courses, workshops or webinars again soon. So thank you so much, Pete, for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for watching and listening. Thank you.